I was standing in the small grocery store on the edge of our quiet suburban town. The warm afternoon light filtered through the wide glass windows, painting the aisles with fading gold. My son, tall and confident, was placing items on the counter with a smile that seemed so ordinary. But then I heard it. The cashier, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, leaned slightly forward. She lowered her voice, but I caught every word. "Your son is not who you think he is." The world stopped around me. The sound of the register, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the chatter of other shoppers, everything faded. My chest tightened as if the air had been stolen from me. I turned my head slowly toward my son, his face calm, his movements steady, as if nothing had been said. But in that single moment, a crack split open in the life I thought I knew. I felt shock, disbelief, and yet, deep inside, a quiet spark of defiance. My heart whispered, "I will find out the truth, no matter what it costs me." The words from the cashier echoed in my mind long after I left the store. "Your son is not who you think he is." They clung to me like a shadow that refused to fade. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps she was mistaken, or perhaps I had misunderstood. But deep in my heart, unease had already planted its seed. That evening, I watched my son closely across the dinner table. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. His fork moved steadily, his face calm, but his eyes did not meet mine. When I asked about his day, his answers were short, almost mechanical, as if he were reciting lines he had already rehearsed. I noticed how often he checked his phone. Each time it buzzed, he tilted the screen slightly away from me, typing quickly before slipping it back into his pocket. His smile, once open and easy, now felt guarded, like a mask he had grown accustomed to wearing. The next day, I found a bank statement left carelessly on the counter. My heart skipped when I saw the numbers. Large amounts of money had been withdrawn, far more than I ever imagined he had access to. The transactions were frequent, irregular, and without any explanation. When I asked him casually, he brushed it off with a laugh, saying it was nothing. But the way his jaw tightened told me otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the distance between us grew. He came home later and later, offering excuses that did not quite make sense. Sometimes he avoided dinner altogether, disappearing into the night with vague promises of work or errands. The boy who once used to share every detail of his day with me now offered only silence. And then there were the phone calls. I would hear his voice behind closed doors, low and tense. Sometimes, when he thought I was asleep, I caught fragments of whispered conversations. Words about money, about deals, about people whose names I did not recognize. Once, when I stepped closer to his door, the floor creaked and he instantly fell silent. By the time I knocked, he had already put his phone away and opened the door with an easy smile. But his eyes gave him away. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong, yet I could not bring myself to confront him directly. Part of me still wanted to believe in him, to hold on to the image of the boy I had raised with love and sacrifice. But another part of me, the part that remembered the cashier's warning, whispered that the truth was darker than I dared to admit. Late at night, I sat awake in the dim glow of the lamp, staring at old photographs of us together. His innocent smile as a child, his proud stance on graduation day, the joy in his eyes when his father clapped him on the back. I searched those faces, desperate to reconcile them with the stranger who now lived under my roof. The silence of the house weighed heavily on me. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the wooden floors, as if the home itself sensed my unease. My thoughts spiraled, circling back again and again to the same question. Who is my son really, and what is he hiding from me? I told myself I would not rest until I knew the truth. I owed it to myself, and, perhaps more importantly, I owed it to the memory of the family we once were. Suspicion had taken root in my soul, and it grew stronger with each passing day, As I sat alone in the quiet of my small living room, the shadows of the past came to me as clearly as if they had been etched on the walls. My suspicion about my son's strange behaviour weighed heavily on my heart, but my memories pulled me backward, reminding me of a time when things had been so different, so filled with warmth and love. I remembered the nights when I worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. I can still feel the ache in my hands from scrubbing floors, and the exhaustion that clung to me as I tucked him into bed. Even in those weary moments, his little arms would wrap around my neck, and he would whisper, "I love you, Mum." Those words were my strength, the reason I endured each sacrifice without regret. There were days when I skipped meals so he could have enough to eat. I remember watching him enjoy a bowl of soup I had stretched thin with water and potatoes, and feeling a strange satisfaction, knowing he was full, even though my stomach remained empty. No luxury ever mattered to me. My happiness was bound entirely to his smile, his laughter, his comfort. When his father was absent, too consumed with work or his own battles, I was the one who became both mother and father. I held his hand at every school play, every sports game, cheering until my voice cracked. I stayed awake long into the night, helping him with homework. My own eyes burning with fatigue, but my heart swelling with pride as he slowly grew into a young man of promise. I remembered one winter when our old heater broke. The nights were brutally cold, and money was scarce. I wrapped him in every blanket we owned, holding him close as he shivered, my body shielding him from the frost. In the darkness, I whispered to him that everything would be all right. He believed me, and because of his trust, I believed it too. There was also the day of his high school graduation. I sat in the crowded auditorium, tears streaming down my face as his name was called. He crossed the stage with a wide grin, holding his diploma high in the air. When his eyes found mine in the crowd, he waved, and for a moment the years of struggle melted away. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every hunger pang was worth it. How strange it feels now to look across the same dinner table and see a young man who no longer shares his life with me. The boy I raised with every breath of my being now keeps secrets from me, answers my questions with half-hearted words, and carries himself as though I am no longer part of his world. The contrast between then and now is a knife that twists deeper with each memory. In the past, I believed that love alone was enough to bind us, that the foundation of sacrifice, devotion, and endless care would be unbreakable. Yet, as I sit in this quiet house, with the echoes of my sacrifices surrounding me, I cannot help but wonder if all of that was invisible to him, if he is already forgotten. Still, even as doubt creeps into me, I cannot erase the truth of those years. I know what I gave. I know who I was. I was his shield, his provider, his greatest ally. And in my heart, I still want to believe that somewhere, deep inside him, the boy who clung to me in the cold, who whispered his love, still exists. But the distance between us has grown like a chasm, and I fear that the bridge we once built with love may already have crumbled. The night had settled quietly over the suburban neighbourhood, but inside Margaret's chest there was no peace. The words of the cashier still lingered in her mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Your son is not who you think he is. For days she had wrestled with unease. Every phone call her son answered in hushed tones, every unexplained withdrawal of money from his account, every look his wife exchanged with him when she thought no one was watching. All of it piled upon her heart until suspicion became unbearable. One evening, Margaret decided she could no longer remain a passive observer in her own life. She slipped into her car and followed her son as he left the house under the excuse of late errands. The streets of the small town were quiet, street lamps glowing dimly against the early mist. She kept a safe distance, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, her mind racing between dread and hope. Her son stopped at a shabby office building on the edge of town. It looked abandoned from the outside, but faint light spilled from a window on the second floor. Margaret parked a block away and waited. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Finally, curiosity overcame fear, and she walked closer, her shoes crunching against gravel. Inside, through a gap in the blinds, she caught sight of her son, seated at a table with two unfamiliar men. Their expressions were hard, their eyes sharp. Papers were spread across the table. Margaret leaned forward, pressing her hand against the cold glass, straining to hear. Then came the words that sent a chill through her veins. "We will need your signature," one of the men said. Her son nodded, his voice low. "Do not worry. My mother will not interfere. She trusts me too much." Margaret's breath caught. Her fingers dug into the windowsill as her heart pounded. She knew then that something deeply sinister was unfolding. Later that night, when her son returned home, Margaret pretended to be asleep, but inside her room she waited, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as her mind replayed the scene. The papers, the men, the betrayal in her son's words. The following morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, Margaret acted. She carefully searched the study where her son often worked. It did not take long. In the drawer beneath stacks of household bills, she found a folder. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were documents she could barely comprehend at first glance. Legal contracts, financial agreements, and one page that screamed at her with undeniable cruelty. There was a transfer of property. Her property. The family house that she and her late husband had built together, the home of her memories and sacrifices, was listed on paper as being prepared for sale. And worse, her son's name and his wife's were scrawled in signatures at the bottom. Margaret's knees weakened, and she sat down heavily on the edge of the desk. The room spun around her. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night she had endured for him, now seemed to twist into a cruel blade. Tears burned her eyes, But in their reflection was not only grief, there was something sharper, resolve. She closed the folder slowly, pressed it against her chest, and whispered to the empty room, "If this is the truth, then I must uncover it all." Margaret had uncovered the first thread of a secret, a thread that, if pulled, would unravel everything she thought she knew about her son. The betrayal was no longer a shadow of suspicion. It had become something real, written in ink and signed in his hand. And, deep inside, she felt the beginnings of a fire that whispered of confrontation, of justice, and, perhaps, of revenge. The morning after discovering the documents, Margaret could no longer carry the weight of silence. She had lived through many storms in her life, but none had cut this deep. She waited until the evening, when her son and his wife returned home. The sound of their laughter at the doorway twisted like a knife in her heart. She stood in the living room, the folder clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her son looked at her with mild surprise, as though she were out of place in her own home. His wife crossed her arms, her lips already curling into the shadow of disdain. "I found these," Margaret said, her voice steady though her chest burned. She laid the documents on the table between them. "Explain this to me." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then her son stepped forward, picked up the top sheet, and smiled, without shame. "It is exactly what you think, Mother," he said. "We are transferring the property. It is time for you to let go. You have had your life here. Now it is ours." Margaret's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall. Her eyes flicked to her daughter-in-law, who smirked openly. "You cannot mean this," Margaret whispered. "This house is my life. Your father and I built it with our hands, with years of sacrifice. Every memory we have is carved into these walls. And you would sell it behind my back?" Her son's expression hardened, his voice low and sharp. "Enough with the sentiment. You cling to the past, Mother. You are a burden now. We are the future, and the future requires space and freedom." The words sliced through her like shards of glass. Each syllable echoed betrayal. Each look stripped away another layer of trust. His wife leaned forward, her tone laced with venom. "You should be grateful we let you stay this long. We have our own plans. Do not interfere again." Margaret's chest heaved. She felt as if the ground beneath her had given way. All her life she had been the foundation of this family. She had fed them, clothed them, fought through hardships so they could thrive. And now, in her own living room, they looked at her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "I gave you everything. My youth, my strength, my love. How dare you throw me aside as if I am nothing?" Her son's eyes flashed cold, his hand slamming against the table. "Do not turn this into drama, Mother." "The decision is final. If you cannot accept it, then perhaps it is time for you to leave." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Margaret's breath trembled. The folder lay open, its pages a cruel testament to betrayal. She felt the warmth of tears sliding down her cheeks. But within those tears, a new steel was forming. Slowly, She gathered the papers and pressed them against her chest. Her gaze met her son's one last time. For a fleeting second, she searched for the boy she had once held in her arms, the boy who had once clung to her hand in fear of the dark. But he was gone, replaced by a stranger, with ambition and greed in his eyes. Without another word, Margaret turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, steady and deliberate. Behind her, she heard her daughter-in-law laugh softly, a sound that sealed the fracture of her heart. That night, alone in her small rented apartment, Margaret sat by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but she felt swallowed by darkness. Yet within that darkness, something stirred. Pain, yes. Grief, yes. But beneath it all, a flame had been kindled, a flame of resolve. The betrayal had exploded into full view, shattering the fragile bonds that once held them together. And though she wept, Margaret knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a battle she never thought she would have to fight. The weeks that followed were a blur of silence and grief. Margaret packed her few belongings into an old suitcase, the same one she had used decades ago when she and her late husband first moved into the house. This time, however, she carried it not with dreams, but with the weight of exile. The front door of her home closed behind her with a sound that felt like finality. She moved into a small rented apartment on the edge of town. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, and the windows let in a draught that chilled her bones at night. Gone were the familiar sounds of her family. Gone was the scent of the roses in the garden she had tended for years. The silence was heavier than any noise. Each day blurred into the next. Margaret would sit at the small kitchen table, staring at the chipped plates, barely eating. Rice and broth became her daily meal, often seasoned with nothing more than the salt of her tears. Loneliness pressed on her like a vice. Even the ticking clock on the wall sounded like an accusation, reminding her of everything she had lost. Sometimes she would walk the streets of the neighborhood, watching families through their windows. Children laughed. Mothers called them to dinner. Fathers came home from work with tired but satisfied smiles. Margaret would stop and look, her heart aching with memories of when her own life had been filled with such simple joys. Now she stood outside, invisible. A stranger in the very world she had once built for her family. At night, the pain was sharpest. She would lie awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the confrontation in the living room, over and over. The coldness in her son's eyes, the cruel smirk of her daughter-in-law, the words that had shattered her heart. Sleep often refused to come, and when it did, it brought dreams of her husband. Dreams of a family that no longer existed. She would wake with tears soaking her pillow, clutching the emptiness beside her. Isolation grew into despair. Friends who once visited her grew distant, unsure how to comfort her, or perhaps unwilling to be part of her sorrow. The phone that once rang with calls from family and neighbours now sat silent. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, each one eroding another piece of her spirit. And yet, even in the darkest hours, a spark remained. It flickered faintly in her eyes, sometimes hidden, sometimes shining through the tears. She would look at the small framed photograph of her husband that she kept by the window, his smile frozen in time, and whisper, "I am not finished." She remembered the lessons of her past. She had survived poverty, sickness, and loss before. She had raised a son with her bare hands, with little more than determination and faith. That strength had not vanished. It was buried beneath the weight of grief, but it was there, waiting. The darkness of despair was real. It surrounded her, suffocated her, made her doubt her worth. But within that darkness was also the soil in which resilience could grow. Margaret could feel it stirring, slowly, quietly. She had been cast aside, but she was not defeated. For now, she lived in sorrow, her days heavy with silence, her nights haunted by betrayal. But deep within her heart, the flame of resistance had not gone out. And though the world saw only a broken woman, Margaret knew that something within her was waiting for the right moment to rise again. The days of despair had stretched into weeks. The small apartment where the mother now lived was quiet to the point of suffocation. She spent hours staring at the walls, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. Every corner of the room reminded her of what she had lost, and yet something inside her refused to fully surrender. One morning, as the pale sunlight filtered through the blinds, she sat at the small wooden table with a pile of old boxes that she had carried from her husband's study before leaving the house. They had remained untouched for months because she did not have the strength to face the memories inside them. But that day, something compelled her to open one of the boxes. Her trembling hands lifted the lid, and inside she found a stack of documents, bound together with a faded ribbon. She unfolded the first pages and froze. The papers were official records, signed by her late husband, carefully drafted to ensure that the property and financial assets would remain under her legal authority. Her breath quickened. She read line after line, each word illuminating a truth that had been hidden from her. The betrayal of her son and his wife was undeniable. But now she held in her hands the key to overturn everything. Her husband, even in death, had not abandoned her. He had protected her in the only way he could. At first, she doubted herself. Could these documents still be valid? Had too much time passed? But the signatures were clear, the seals unbroken. The legal weight of these pages was undeniable. For the first time in months, her heart felt something more than pain. It felt possibility. As she leaned back in her chair, tears streamed down her face. They were not tears of grief alone, but of awakening. She thought of the cashier's words that had unsettled her weeks before. She thought of the cold expression on her son's face as he told her she was no longer welcome. And she thought of the nights spent in silence, clutching her chest, wondering if she had the strength to go on. Now she knew. She was not broken. She was wounded, yes, but beneath the wounds lived a fire that no betrayal could extinguish. With trembling but determined fingers, she gathered the documents and placed them neatly in a folder. The next step was clear. She needed guidance. She would seek a lawyer, someone who could read these pages and confirm what her instincts already told her. She could already imagine the faces of her son and daughter-in-law when they would be confronted with this truth. For the first time in a long time, she stood up from her chair with strength in her legs. She walked across the room, opened the window, and let the cool air brush against her face. The world outside seemed brighter, as though the universe itself had been waiting for her to discover this moment. The despair had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled her. A spark of hope had been lit, and with it came a new vision. This was no longer the end of her story. This was the beginning of her revenge. Margaret did not rush. She had learned the hard lesson that anger without a plan dissolves into chaos. The documents she had found were more than paper. They were a map. They revealed not only the intent to take the house, but also the methods her son and his wife had used to mask their maneuver. She treated each line, each signature, as a clue to be followed. First, she sought counsel, not the hurried phone calls she had made in the past to friends, but a careful meeting with an attorney who specialised in estate law. The man she chose sat quietly and listened as she laid out the papers, his expression grave and focused. He confirmed what Margaret already suspected. The earlier will and associated documents carried legal force, but they had to be authenticated, presented and defended with precision. It would not be enough to wave the papers and demand justice. Law required proof, process, and patience. They drew up a plan in measured steps. Embed the documents with a forensic review, secure affidavit testimony from witnesses who could verify the family history, trace any suspicious transfers of funds, and file emergency motions to prevent the dissipation of assets while litigation unfolded. Each requirement had a deadline and a purpose. Margaret recorded them in a notebook with a steady hand, as if by writing the plan, she could make it inevitable. The next weeks were a study in quiet industry. Margaret moved like a woman doubled by grief, but armed with resolve. She travelled to the county clerk, requesting certified copies and records of property titles. She visited the small bank branch where her late husband had kept accounts, speaking to a manager about unusual withdrawals and transfers. At times she felt the old shame of needing help, but she swallowed it. Pride could be a luxury for those who still had the comfort of certainty. She had none of that now. She had the will to act. Her attorney arranged for a forensic document examiner to analyse the ink and paper of the competing wills. The examiner came with sterile gloves and a careful eye, explaining the process step by step. Margaret sat close and watched as he compared dates, seals, and signatures. Every small confirmation was a victory, and she felt each one like a match struck to light a larger blaze. She also began to gather people. Allies did not merely appear, they were cultivated. Margaret reached out to the housekeeper, who had been with the family for decades, to the neighbour who had watched her dig the garden, to the old accountant who had handled small invoices in quieter years. Some were reluctant at first, afraid of the upheaval that might follow. Others came quickly. Shame and loyalty combining to make them willing witnesses. Meanwhile, Margaret learned restraint. Her attorney cautioned her about tone and timing. Do not vent publicly, he advised. Do not confront her son in a way that could be used to paint her as unstable. Every public outburst could become a liability. Every hasty action an opening for their defenders. She heeded his counsel and practiced silence that was not submission, but strategy. There were nights when the loneliness returned with a vengeance. She would sit at the kitchen table, the little lamp casting a soft circle of light, and the notebook open between her hands. She rehearsed testimony in the hush, forming sentences that would anchor her claims in fact rather than feeling. She practiced naming dates and amounts, not abstract grievances. Preparation, she realized, turned wounds into evidence. Small tactical moves followed. A temporary restraining order was drafted preemptively in case her son attempted to transfer assets. Subpoenas were prepared to retrieve bank statements. The private investigator she had reluctantly approved sent reports with photographs and timelines of suspicious pickups and late-night meetings. Each piece slotted into place like a hinge on a long-closed door. And yet beneath all the legal steps, beneath the meetings and the filings, something more personal grew. Margaret felt the transformation from victim to agent. The fire that had been kindled in the depths of despair was being channeled into focused resolve. She would not be defined by the cruelty that had been visited upon her. She would define the outcome. When the first packet of authenticated evidence was finally ready for filing, Margaret sat very still and felt a strange mix of fear and calm. This was the moment when private grief would be translated into public truth. She rose from the table, folded the papers gently into a folder, and for the first time since the cashier uttered that warning, she felt not only the prospect of restitution, but the presence of power. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and anxious sweat. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands resting on a folder that contained months of quiet work and sleepless nights. Across from her sat her son and his wife, draped in the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. Their attorney whispered in low tones, smirking as if the outcome were predetermined. The judge entered, the bailiff called for order, and the proceedings began. At first, the case seemed to follow the rhythm her son's side expected. Their lawyer stood and painted Margaret as unstable, a grieving widow consumed by paranoia. He spoke with the assurance of a man who believed reputation and intimidation could outweigh facts. Margaret listened in silence, her face unreadable. Then her attorney rose. Calm, deliberate, he presented the first document. The courtroom grew quiet as he explained the certified provenance of the older will, signed and notarized years before, untouched by alteration. Each page carried seals and signatures that had been authenticated by forensic experts. When the judge examined them, his brow furrowed in recognition of their legitimacy. The son shifted uneasily. The daughter-in-law squeezed his arm, her nails digging in. But Margaret's attorney was not finished. He introduced financial statements that traced suspicious withdrawals and transfers, showing a clear pattern of misappropriation. The bank records were precise. The dates aligned with moments when Margaret had been deliberately excluded from decisions. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Then came the witnesses. The housekeeper testified that she had overheard conversations where the daughter-in-law insisted that Margaret be pushed aside. The accountant confirmed that he had been pressured to conceal certain transactions. The neighbour described the night he had seen Margaret locked out of her own home. Each testimony stacked upon the last, like bricks building a fortress around the truth. Her son's lawyer tried to object, but the judge's gavel cut him short. The weight of evidence was undeniable. Margaret sat still, her eyes lowered, but her chest lifted slightly with every fact revealed. She was no longer invisible. Finally, Margaret herself took the stand. Her voice was calm, measured, without anger, but filled with something stronger: clarity. She spoke of years of sacrifice, of nights working 2 jobs, of standing in the shadows so her son could stand in the light. She spoke not as a victim, but as a mother whose strength had been underestimated. The courtroom leaned forward, caught in the quiet force of her words. Her attorney then delivered the final twist. Beyond the will, beyond the financial fraud, he unveiled another truth. Margaret's late husband had left a letter, sealed and witnessed, declaring his faith in her judgment and his distrust of the greed he feared might corrupt their son. The letter was read aloud, the voice of the deceased echoing through the chamber. The words were devastating, not only restoring Margaret's claim, but shattering the illusion her son and daughter-in-law had built around themselves. The daughter-in-law gasped audibly, her composure breaking. The son's face drained of colour, his earlier arrogance replaced with the shock of betrayal by the father he thought he had outmaneuvered. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the sound of a family's secret unravelling in public. The judge delivered the ruling with authority. The estate and the house were restored to Margaret. The son and daughter-in-law were left with nothing, their schemes exposed, their reputations in ruins. The gavel struck, final and echoing. In that moment, Margaret did not smile. She did not revel in triumph. She stood with dignity, her face carrying the scars of pain but also the quiet power of survival. As her son and his wife crumbled, she turned not toward them, but toward the future. Margaret walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight. The world outside was the same, yet it felt reborn. She whispered to herself, almost as a prayer, but also as a declaration. Never underestimate a mother's strength. The phrase lingered in the air, not only for her, but for anyone who might one day doubt the quiet resilience of a woman who had given everything, lost everything, and then reclaimed both justice and dignity. The courtroom had fallen into silence after the final ruling. The echoes of the gavel still seemed to vibrate in the air. Yet, within that silence, there was something even more profound. The collapse of 2 lives that had once been tied by blood and love, and the rise of a woman who had been underestimated for too long. The mother stood still, her back straight despite the tremor of emotions that coursed through her veins. She had walked through despair, betrayal, and loneliness, and now she stood as the undeniable symbol of strength. Her son and his wife had left the courtroom with bowed heads, their steps heavy, their dreams of victory shattered into fragments. They had not only lost the inheritance they believed to be theirs, but also their dignity. Their masks of arrogance ripped apart by the truth. The documents, the evidence, the testimony had all been clear. Their plan was nothing but a fragile web torn apart by the determination of the woman they thought they had already defeated. For a moment, as she watched them stumble away, her heart ached. She remembered the boy she had once cradled in her arms, the child who had once clung to her dress in fear of the world. That memory pierced her, But she did not let it weaken her resolve. Love and sacrifice had carried her through decades, but betrayal had carved an entirely different kind of strength within her soul. When she walked out of the courthouse, the sky seemed brighter, though tears welled in her eyes. They were not tears of defeat, but of release. She had reclaimed what was hers, but more importantly, she had reclaimed herself. The weight of years of silence had been lifted, replaced by the clarity of justice. Her old home, once filled with laughter and shadows of betrayal, now awaited her return. As she entered the living room, her hand traced the familiar wood of the staircase, the walls that had borne witness to both her sacrifices and her suffering. She sat down in the armchair by the window, the same spot where she used to wait for her husband to return home, the same spot where she had dreamed of a happy family, united forever. The house was quiet, but this silence did not suffocate her as it once had. It was a silence of peace, of strength. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling with a sense of liberation. She had fought back against the darkness and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. Her story was not just about revenge. It was about resilience, about the unbreakable will of a woman who had been underestimated, pushed aside, and silenced. Now her voice carried weight again, and her presence filled the room with authority. She whispered softly to herself, as though speaking to the echoes of her past and the unseen witnesses of her struggle. Never underestimate a mother's strength. The words lingered in the air, not as a threat, but as a truth carved by experience. They were a reminder to herself, and to anyone who would ever dare to question her again. And in that moment, as the sun cast a warm glow through the curtains, she knew that her journey had not been in vain. The scars of betrayal would remain, but they would no longer define her. What defined her now was survival, resilience, and the unshakable strength that had carried her through the storm. She was home, and she was whole again. And so, her journey came full circle. From the shadows of betrayal to the light of justice, she proved that no wound, no humiliation could silence the strength of a mother's heart. Her enemies believed they had buried her, but in truth, they had only planted the seed of her rebirth. Now, in the silence of her home, she does not weep for what was lost. She rises for what was reclaimed, her dignity, her voice, her rightful place. The scars remain, but they no longer bind her. They shine as proof of her resilience. This was never just about wealth, nor about revenge alone. It was about survival. It was about a woman who refused to be broken, who chose to fight when the world expected her to fall. And so, let this story echo far beyond the walls of her house. Never underestimate a mother, for within her silence lives a fire, and within her tears lives a power that no betrayal can extinguish.